We are going to start tonight, and what is kind of the theme for our VBS that we're going to be doing all summer long? All right, investigating creation. Very good. And that's what we're going to be doing tonight, but then we're going to be doing it every night, every Wednesday night at this same time. All right? Now, I just want to know, is there anybody who is curious, like this little boy up on our screen? Anybody? You want to say you're curious? Do you ever wonder why things happen? Do you ever wonder how things work? Yeah, there's a few of you that are curious, aren't you? Yeah, put your hands down. Very good. You know what? I'm curious too. And there's lots of times when I wonder why things are happening and how they work. And there's one question that sometimes kids wonder. And that question is this right here. Can you read that up there? Can you see? Okay, yes. How did the world begin? Have you ever thought about that question before? No? Well, some people do. Good. But you know what? The problem is when we start to think about that question, there's different answers. And Pastor Steve was talking a little bit about those answers that we get sometimes. And so the first one that we want to talk about is evolution. And you might hear about this in school. You might read about it in books. You might see it on TV. But evolution, they will teach you that the world took billions of years to make. And it started with just one little tiny cell. And over billions and billions of years, then everything evolved and it changed until we got the animals and the plants and even people that we have today. So this is the idea about evolution. Now, there's another one that we have, and that is creation. And creation tells us that God made the world and he made it in 6 days. Now, if you hear about those two ideas of how the world began, are they alike or are they really different? What do you think, Kaylee? You think they're alike? So if someone says the world started with a little tiny cell and it took thousands and millions of years until we finally developed into all these things, does that sound like God made everything in 6 days? And that doesn't to me either. They're really different, aren't they? And if they're really different, can both of those things be true? No, one of them has to be true, and one of them is probably not true then, right? So probably in science class, you've been learning a few terms. And tonight we want to look about things that are fact and things that are fiction. Now you might say, I don't know what those words mean, Miss Michelle. Well, good, because we're going to talk about them. Do you know what they mean? Okay, hold on just a second, and I'm going to ask you what they mean, okay? But before we get there, we're going to learn another word. And I know some of you that are in 4th grade, 5th grade, or maybe even some are in 6th grade, have probably heard that word at the top. That first word at the top. Can anybody read that? Let me see. Hannah, what's it say? Hypothesis, yes. And Hannah, what is a hypothesis? What does it say up there? Okay, it's an idea, it's a guess, but it has to be proven. And many of you in your science classes, you might do experiments. You might have a guess of something that you think is going to happen, and then you have to find out if that's really what's going to happen or not. And that's what a hypothesis is. It's an idea that has to be proved. So we have a question that we've asked tonight. How did the world begin? And we have two ideas. We have evolution and we have creation. And so both of them, we're going to try to investigate and discover and try to decide which one is, our first word was fact. And you told me you know what those words mean. What is fact?
Something that is known or proved to be true.
Okay, so if something is a fact, either we know it or it's been proved to be true. And the opposite is also, what is the opposite? Fiction. And what does fiction mean?
Something that is false or not true.
Okay, right. That means it's not true, it's false. And so either things are fact or they're fiction. So we're going to think about evolution and creation tonight and think about which one might be a fact, which one might be a fiction. Now, anytime you hear an idea, you always want to investigate. Just because you hear something doesn't mean you should just say, oh, it's got to be true. Now you've got to look. You've got to look for some evidence. And a lot of times, if we are looking for how something began, we would just go and ask somebody, hey, did you see that? Can you tell me how this got started? But can we do that with how the world began? Jet, you're saying, shaking your head no. Why can't we do that? Okay, no human being was there at the beginning of the world. So no one observed it, did they? So we've got to use some other investigative skills to try to figure out which one is true and which one is false. So tonight we're going to look at some evidence and we're going to try to see which one might be true and which one might be false. All right? So first of all, we're going to look at evolution. All right? And this word evolution really just means to change. So it's talking about a change that has happened between animals and people and plants. And has anybody ever heard of the person who started evolution? Do you know his name? Adam. No, he didn't start evolution. Do you know? No? How about you? Do you know?
Father John.
No, that's a good thought. No? Oh, I thought maybe you would all know this. His name was Charles Darwin. Have you ever heard about him in school before?
No.
Never? Oh, you have. Okay, well, good. Yes. All right, so Charles Darwin was a man who believed, and he was the one who promoted evolution. And this is what he believed and sort of what he taught. He said that the world began as a little single cell. A cell is like a little dot that you can't even see with your eyes by themselves. You have to get that cell underneath a microscope and you have to magnify it many, many times before you can see it. And so he said the world began as this little tiny cell. And then over thousands of years, those cells began to grow, began to divide. It began to get into more complex cells. And then those complex cells, they began to change. And they began to develop into plants. And they started developing into different animals. And then those animals developed into other animals. And before long, we had people in the mix as well. And before long, what we see in the world would have been the things that were there. And so these are the kind of things that Charles Darwin would have taught and would have promoted. Now, some of you might be thinking, where did that little single cell start? Where did it come from? Is anybody curious and wondering about that? Good, I'm glad. All right, put your hands down. Do you see up in our picture up on the screen? Do you see that big light that looks like a big explosion? Well, that's how many people that believe in evolution, that's what they think. That's how that little cell got started. That there was a big explosion that happened, and that's how the cell came. Other people say, it was just an accident. It just happened, but we don't really know how it happened. So anyway, that's a little bit about evolution. Now, who can remember that big word that we talked about a little while ago that means a guess that has to be proved? Tucker, do you remember? Good job. Awesome. Hypothesis. And a hypothesis, remember, has to be proved, which means we have to have some evidence to do that. So we're going to talk about some evidence. And the very first evidence, who can read up on the screen and tell me what's our first evidence? Jalen, can you tell us? Yeah, fossils. And I tried to pick out some really cool fossils up here, but fossils are the remains of living things. So it could have been a plant, it could have been an animal, but it's something that was alive but has been buried either in the ground or underwater, okay? And so the evolutionists will tell us that fossils show that we have many animals that we don't have today and that they don't look like what we have today. But they'll say that fossils were able to show us those things. All right, then here's another thing, that another evidence of evolution. Yeah, can you tell us what that says up there? DNA. Who's ever heard of DNA before? Oh, good. Does anybody happen to know what DNA stands for? Yes? Can you remember? It is this super, super, super long word.
I know, I just can't get it.
It's something like, I've been practicing for 3 days, so I want to remember how to pronounce this word. Deoxyribonucleic acid, something like that. All right, but you know what? It's fine to call it DNA for short, okay? And the pictures that are up here, this is what DNA looks like. Now, again, you can't just get your eye out and say, oh, let me see your DNA, Haley. No, because this has been under a microscope and has been enlarged, magnified many, many times. But this is what DNA looks like. Now, everything that is alive has DNA. And what do you think DNA does? Yes?
What kind of blood you are.
Okay. It could be what kind of blood you have. What else?
What your personality is.
It might have to do with your personality, yeah?
What kind of culture that
I don't know about your culture so much. Yeah, do you have one? It sort of tells you, it tells you what you're going to look like. Why do some of you have brown eyes and some of you have blue eyes? It's because of your DNA. Why do some of you have blonde hair or brown hair or red hair or black hair? It's because your DNA. Why do some of you have curly hair? Does anybody have curly hair? Well, maybe sort of curly, yeah. Who has a, Tori sort of has curly hair. And why do some of us have really straight hair? It's our DNA. Why are some of us really, really, really tall and some of us really, really, really short? It's in our DNA. How come your feet? Some people's feet are really big and some people's feet are really short. How come some of you put your gloves on today and you say, I can't get my gloves on because your fingers are really big? That's all your DNA, and that's what makes you different from everybody else. And it's all involved in this here. Now you're probably going to look at that and say, wow, those look kind of like my mom's necklaces. But it's not. They're not beads. They're not necklaces. Inside each one of those things are specific information that makes you, you. And that makes every living thing different. But the people that believe in evolution say, we've looked at DNA and all DNA looks like it comes from the same thing. That one little cell. Remember I told you about that was a big explosion? They point and use this as evidence for that. All right, then I have one other thing, and we have to go really quickly. But I don't know if you can see behind the screen, but this is called a mutation. And you see, your body is made up of thousands and millions of cells. And these cells are constantly making new cells, okay? But sometimes when they're making cells, there's kind of like a mistake or a difference that happens, okay? And these are what we call mutations then. So if you look up at that flower, all the petals are pink except for one. How did it get to be white? Well, something happened. There was a problem in the DNA, in those cells, and it came out white. If you look over here, you'll see those tigers. And most of the time, we see tigers that are orange with black stripes, right? But if you look at each one of them, there's something different about every single one of those tigers that are up there. Because That's a mutation. It's just something that's different about each one of them in their cells or in their genes. This one up here, that orange, if you notice the one on the left side, this one has a ton of seeds in it. The one on this side, though, does it have seeds in it?
No.
Not very many, is it? Because of the way they've made it, it's changed a little bit. And there's a really neat story about these birds down here. They're called finches. And we are not going to have time to talk about that right now. But if you ask me later, or maybe next week, I can tell you about those finches, because it's a really fun story about those finches. And then, yes, if you look at that little lamb, what's happening with our lamb? Anybody see something? Yeah, it has 5 legs instead of 4. It was a mistake. It was a difference that was happening. These are all called mutations, okay? Now, the evolutionists will say, well, these mutations are how things kind of went from one thing to another. But what I want to show you about is each one of these, it does have changes, doesn't it? But are they changing from one plant or one animal to a totally different one? Or is it just the same kind with a difference? Like these birds. They're all the same birds, but it's just their beaks that are different. The tigers, they're all still tigers. Their skin is just looking different. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not a totally different species whatsoever. All right, now that's a little bit about evolution. Quickly, we want to talk about creation. Creation tells us that the Bible tells us about creation, and it tells us that God made the world in 6 days. And there's some very special things that are told to us about creation. Where do we find our information about creation?
Bible.
In the Bible, that's right. The Bible, especially in Genesis chapter 1, tells us that, number 1, God made everything. And he didn't make it from stuff that was in his laboratory. There was nothing on the world. So he started with nothing, and the Bible says he just spoke, and everything was done. It was made. Whatever he said, let there be a giraffe, and there was a giraffe. Let there be light, and there was a light. Let there be the sun, and there was the sun. Now, we could spend a long time talking about if the Bible is true or not. And we don't have time tonight, but there is much evidence to know that the Bible really is true. And so we can believe what the Bible says. Now, here's another thing, and this we really want to talk about. You might have heard Pastor Steve talk a little bit about this. Do you see down in the corner? Who can read what that word is? Yes, Jet. Designer. And I tried to put some things up on the screen today. We've got a house, a car, a TV with Spider-Man, of course, and we've got cell phones. Now, I'm just going to ask you a question. Have you ever been at your house and maybe you've been sitting on the couch or on your bed, and all of a sudden you just saw this bright light, and it looked like a big explosion, and then as soon as it calmed down, you looked and you said, oh, wow, look, there's a cell phone right there. And you turn it on and it works, and it's amazing. Has anybody ever had that happen to them before? You have? Wow, I'm coming to your house then for sure. I have never had that. And I don't think most of us have. You see, when we look at these cell phones, we look at them and we say, wow, these are really, they're complicated things, how it can do all those things. And it's just this little tiny piece of technology. And we look at cars and TVs and even houses. And when you look at all those things, we say, wow, somebody smart must have designed that, right? And not only that, when we look around at other things, scientists are learning a lot about our eyes. And they say our eyes are amazing things. And you can see all the parts that are there. And all of those parts are needed to make your eye. And if some of them are missing, then you won't be able to see correctly or see at all. But whenever you look at your eye and you see all those parts and you know that they all work together, we would say, somebody smart must have made that eye. You may have learned about this in school as well. Here we have the sun and we have the earth. And does anybody know how far away the sun is from the earth? It's a long way. Do you know?
Maybe like 2,000.
No. I think, if I remember right, it is like 93 trillion miles away. That's a long way. But here's my point. How did it get to be exactly where it is? What would happen if we moved the sun or the earth closer to the sun?
We would burn.
Yeah, go ahead.
It would explode.
Well, it might explode, but you're right, we would burn up, wouldn't we? And what if we moved the earth farther away than the sun?
Okay.
Do you know?
The sun would never be on Earth again.
Yeah, we might not get the sunshine and it wouldn't be warm like we have, would it? Who determined or how did the earth and the sun get put right where they are? Somebody smart must have done that, right? And we know that the Bible tells us that somebody smart was God himself. Now, one last thing that we're going to talk about really quick, and I don't know if you can see these words down here, but it says life comes from life. There is a scientific principle that says that life has to come from life. And the Bible tells us that God, who is alive, created all things that are living. Whereas, what does evolution tell us? Some explosion happened, and all of a sudden, out of nothing, here's a living cell. How did that living cell get there? It just happened. It just happened, is what they say. But how can something that's not alive all of a sudden make something that's alive? It doesn't go with what science tells us. Science says life has to start from something that's alive. And God is alive, and he can make something that's alive. And if you see all of the things in these pictures, every single of the things that are up here, there's a mother and there's a baby. Of course, the tree, there's a big tree and there's a little acorn. But each one of those things also gives birth to whatever kind it is. Because that's part of the scientific principles as well, and that's what God has made for us. Now, this is just a little reminder of what we've talked about tonight. We talked about evolution. All things began as just a single cell, and it took billions of years. And we talked about fossils and DNA and mutations. Creation, we said God made all things. It took 6 days. The Bible tells us about that. And we can say that an evidence for creation is that it's a designer and that life comes from life. So these are all the things that we've talked about tonight. And I hope that as you think about them, that if you think about the things about evolution, not everything about evolution really measures up and really can we say is true. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking about creation and see if the evidences for creation really do measure up and if they're true. All right? Now, we are going to get ready to go over to these tables. And I am just thinking that we might need more tables. What do you think? So I think there are some more tables in the back there. So maybe we could grab 2 more. And then we want to try to do something like maybe 4 to, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have about 20 people. So let's try to get no more than 5 people per table, okay? Now this is what we're going to do. One of the things that you heard me talk about tonight was DNA, right? So we are going to go and look at some DNA. You're going to make some DNA, all right? So you can see it, all right? So we're going to give you a little piece of paper with some directions, and we have some adults that are going to help. You must read your directions and follow them. If it says to stir slowly, we mean stir slowly. Don't go really fast, or it's probably not going to work, okay? All right? Now, then, why don't the front row, you can stand up and walk over to this side. You'll want to put your gloves on, and if you have your your glasses, you want to do that too.
Kids, we're going to do this lab experiment that we did investigating creation. And so if you weren't able to be here, then this is the experiment that we did. And we'll post the directions for you. This is to make our onion DNA, all right? Now, we are taking an onion, and you're just gonna cut it into little chunks, and you'll put it inside a blender. And then inside the blender, you'll also put a teaspoon of salt, just any kind of salt will do. And then you want to add 1.5 cups of water with that and blend it up for about 10 or 15 seconds. Now, we have already done that, and so this is kind of what it's gonna look like when you're all done. This is our mushy onion mixture is what it calls for. And it will make quite a bit of this, okay? So no worries on that. And then you'll pour this into a colander in order to let or a strainer in order to let all of the water come out. And when you get done with that, sort of letting it come out, then you will just have this clear onion juice now. And that's where we're gonna start. So on our directions, we're actually gonna start on step number 3 right now. So here is our cup, and I'm gonna give our cup to our assistant, and she is gonna pour 1/4 a cup of our onion juice into our cup right here, okay? So let's measure out 1/4 of a cup. Try to get it onto the cup, there you go. Make it all the way full. Okay, good. All right, pour that into there. All right, so that's what we're supposed to do in step number 4, or step number 3. Step number 4 then, we're going to add 2 teaspoons, so we need this here again, 2 teaspoons of dish soap. Any kind of dish soap will do, but 2 teaspoons. So go ahead and put 1 inside there, and then dump it in, and then get a second one. All right, perfect. And then we won't need that spoon again, so we can put that away. And then the next thing we're gonna do is put meat tenderizer, and we're going to use just a little less than 1/4 of a teaspoon. So that's our 1/4 of a teaspoon, and you don't want it quite full, but you need most of it full. Yeah, I think that's good. So you want to put that in there. All right, we're going to cover this up so we don't make a mess. All right, and then you can take a spoon or a craft stick, as we have here, and you're going to stir. Now listen, it says gently. So you don't want to just be stirring really, really, really hard. You want to try to do it as gently as you can. You're just stirring in that meat tenderizer that we put in, and also the dish soap. Good. All right, now after you've stirred it in for just a few minutes there, I think that's probably good. Then you're gonna take your stir stick out and just set it down, and for 10 minutes, you just have to let it sit here. For 10 minutes, we don't touch it, we don't do anything to it. Don't try to bump it, don't try to move it, don't try to look into it. You can look, just don't touch it, all right? So let's wait for 10 minutes. All right, now we have let our mixture sit for 10 minutes. So now we're ready to move on to step number 6. Now, step number 6 talks about this alcohol, and we're using 91% alcohol. And you want 1/4 of a cup of 91% alcohol. So go ahead and pour that. Oops, be careful. Good. Good, get it all the way full. We need a full 1/4 of a cup, a little bit more. Okay, that's good. All right, now, very slowly, the directions say slowly pour that in there. You don't want to pour it really fast, just very slowly, pour that in there. Very good. And as you're pouring this very slowly, you also want to remember, when you're all done, do not stir it. Okay, just let it set for another few minutes, and then as you're sitting here watching it, there's going to start to be white, kind of stringy globs that are going to start to form, and that is your DNA, or the onion's DNA. And so you can then take your stick and you can try to get them out a little bit. You can put your fingers in if you want, whatever you feel comfortable in. But that is the onion DNA. And if you remember in our class, we talked about DNA is what gives certain characteristics to a plant, to an animal, or to a human being. And so this is what would be giving the onion the characteristics that it had. And so I can start to see a little bit of the DNA that's forming in here. So we can take our stick and we can try to get a little bit of that out. I'm trying to get a few of them up. It doesn't want to stick to my thing very well. We'll try to bring the camera up a little closer, but you can see a little bit of the globs that are there. You can see some of the stringiness and the globs that are there. Now, our DNA does not quite look like this, and if you remember, we said we can't really see our DNA, but this is just an example of it because we're trying to make the DNA stick together so that we can actually see. Oh, look at this. Here's a couple globs right there. Do you see them? So this would be something similar to what DNA would look like if it was all put together. Now some of the kids were really putting their fingers in. Tori, do you want to put some of your fingers in? I can't seem to make it attached to my finger, but anyway, that's a little bit of what our onion DNA experiment is all about. So I hope you'll have fun trying this experiment here wherever you might be as well. All right. We'll talk to you next week. Be ready for another fun experiment next week.